Hello, you're listening to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles, a product of Lee Enterprises. I'm Chris Lay, the podcast operations manager here at Lee and the host of the show. Now, with Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles, we are presenting notable true crime stories as reported by journalists for the dozens of various Lee Enterprises owned publications from around America. And for this set of episodes, we are traveling to Wilbur, Nebraska, where in November of 2017, 24-year-old Sydney Loofe left work to go on a second date with a person she met on a dating app and never came home. What you're about to hear is a bonus episode. We'll have the final episode, episode 4, next week, but for now, bonus episode. It's going to be an interview that I did with Lori Pilger, who's a journalist at the Lincoln Journal-Star. We talked about what it was like to cover the trial, the missing persons case, and field phone calls from Aubrey Trail. It was really insightful and shed a lot of light on the process and just what it's like to be in a newsroom. As always, if you appreciate what we're doing with this program or any other true crime podcast for that matter, we encourage you to invest in local journalism and support whichever newspaper it is that serves your community. Again, we'll be back next week with the 4th and final installment. This bonus episode begins after a short break. Lori Pilger?
That's right.
You've been a journalist at the Lincoln Journal for how long?
Since 2005. I worked at my hometown paper in Norfolk, Nebraska, so for 8 years up until that time.
And have you always been covering courts and crime?
The Norfolk Daily News was a smaller paper, so I kind of wore more hats there. But yes, I focused primarily on the police and court beat.
Did you cover any other stuff that had garnered that level of national intrigue or the circus nature of everything about it?
It was certainly the most dramatic kind of case to come before me to this point. In Norfolk, when I was working there was a killing at the U.S. Bank where 3 guys went into a bank and killed 5 people, and that got national attention, but not to the same degree over the same period of time as this one. Just kind of unraveled and wound, and there were twists and turns, whereas that one seemed a bit more straightforward, terribly tragic in its own way, but not quite like this one.
One of the things that just keeps jumping out at me, and I'm even going through the story multiple times, I'm continuously astonished at the way that Aubrey Trail specifically incorporated the media into kind of shaping, to what end, I don't honestly know, the narrative around him and Bailey Boswell and everything that went on with that. What was that like from your end, having to navigate the random phone calls that you get from him and, handling how to package that information in a way that wouldn't bend too far from, salacious into newsworthy, and because it's a little bit of both and you got to maintain an appropriate tone in dealing with it.
Sure. I mean, when we would get calls from Aubrey Trail, we always had to wonder, what does he hope to gain from telling us this? He told a lot of stories. I said before, I trust the guy as far as I could throw him, and he's not a small guy, but he's a con man. You just know it from the get-go. So then you have to take everything in from that perspective of, why is he telling us this? I know we had law enforcement cautioning us that he was probably trying to send messages of some kind to Bailey to let her know what he was saying to police. And that was, we don't want to be played. We don't want to be a mouthpiece for someone to circumvent the justice system. So we wanted to be cautious about, and there were times that we had interviews with him, talked to him on the phone, and then found out that he was completely feeding us a line. He was talking about how they'd found more bodies, and we would go on these wild goose chases. There was one in particular where we're calling law enforcement saying, well, he's saying that he took you to other bodies, and it was all just made up. So you always had to be really cautious. And we tried to talk things through before we'd even put it in a story, because while everybody's interested in what he's talking about, we don't want to be promoting a false narrative or, his story evolved all over the place. The only thing that stayed The same was that Bailey wasn't involved. So he was clearly trying to protect her.
And I mean, there's multiple articles that, start with, he said this on this day, and then he said this on, that month, and then he said this to us, but he said this to the cops, and everything in court definitely seems like it was all over the place. And yeah, I noted when he was talking about 2 years ago, I guess at the time in 2018 when he was talking to law enforcement and pre-trial and all that stuff, the talking about giving up open cases in 2 years previously and telling them where bodies were, and it just, yeah, none of that seems to have materialized. Even when he was talking with the fraud case with the gold coins that he had defrauded that Kansas family out of, hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was talking in that trial about how the Loofe case and that case are going to end up being connected, and how Sydney Loofe had been involved with them. And it's hogwash. I mean, it's
Right.
yeah. Did you get a sense of any larger goal that he was trying to do? 'Cause I'm just having a really difficult time piecing this together into some, like, how any of this could have benefited him
Sure.
or Bailey for that matter.
I get the sense that the story evolved as he got reports and from his defense attorney, like maybe he would keep tiny threads of the truth, and then he would build on it and create some elaborate story using one bit of, the fact that they didn't find her organs. Well, that could be explained by the terrible, gruesome way that the body was disposed of, and animals, unfortunately, like being left out there. I mean, there could have been plausible reasons. And then he said that he made up stories about what he did with them, and drinking her blood and draining the body. And it's just like, you wonder, you really are left not to know how much of it is truth, how much of it is just a fabrication based on other information that was out there that he was getting.
Have there been any other examples in your professional experience where someone has just seemingly not even really like played the court system, but taken advantage of how, like, it just didn't seem like the court was prepared for him in, to be capable of holding him to account in any way, given the antics that he did? Is there anything that feels similar that you've experienced? Or
He was a whole different level. I think his defense attorney put it the best at the appeal hearing the other day. Ben Murray said that we all kind of expected something to happen at trial. He was someone known for grand gestures and like making scenes, and so everybody was waiting to see in what way he would act out or do something. And so that's like when the throat slashing came. I mean, nobody really anticipated that. I mean, how can you?
And I mean, like you wrote in the story from this past Thursday with the Supreme Court appeal for a mistrial, how do you unsee that? How does that not taint a jury? And yeah, it's difficult to imagine that, but it's also, I certainly don't want any kind of larger precedent of, if you attempt suicide in court, then it's an automatic mistrial. That doesn't.
Right. That does sound like exactly what the Supreme Court justices are dealing with right now. I mean, I think everybody agrees seeing something so shocking in court is unusual in such a way that how do you, as a juror, set that aside and act as if it didn't exist or it didn't happen, because it did and you saw it.
One of the things that has jumped out at me in kind of going over this story and, really discovering it for the first time, is that the way that the police and the courts handled everything, where it took almost a year, it seems, to have actually charged them. Is that at all, maybe not normal, but I mean, were they just trying to build a case against them during that time? Or there's a lot of like dead spaces in the timeline of the coverage of this, because you get these little bursts of activity. But when Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail were in jail in Kansas for the fraud case, for their antiques dealings, he's basically saying, like, why haven't they charged us? We all know why I'm here.
Mhm.
Was there any larger idea of why they were taking so long to be charged for that crime?
It did seem unusual. I guess that to me, that federal case, the federal fraud case, took the pressure off prosecutors to because they weren't going anywhere. They knew where they were. They were locked up. They weren't going anywhere. I think they maybe were hoping that Bailey Boswell would come to her senses and give the full story. She never cooperated with law enforcement. So I think maybe to some degree they were hoping for some kind of breakthrough that way, because when you get down to it, there likely were only the two of them there, although Aubrey Trail has given different versions of saying other women were in the room when Sydney was killed. But we don't really know, prosecutors don't really know exactly how that played out. And it would have been really helpful to have someone giving a narrative of exactly what happened when they got to Wilbur that night.
And that's another aspect of this where you have Aubrey Trail being the one who is, I mean, talkative to an egregious degree, or to a indefensible degree, I guess. And Bailey Boswell, on the other hand, I think even was the judge in Kansas, I believe, was like, "Do you have anything that you want to say?" And she's just like, "No, ma'am." And that was it. That was all that she said. So it's a really weird imbalance, I guess. And the sad thing is just there is no closure to it, because you have a certain list of things that and then you've got some things that you don't know, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff in between. That's where all it seems like the majority of this story is in that sort of between.
Right.
Do you see any longer term effects that this trial has had in, I guess, the court system, or the way that not just the newspaper that you work for, but any other print publications or media outlets, I guess, are going to be covering things of this nature, where someone is trying to potentially play the press?
I mean, that's a good question. I know it can be seen as kind of a case study for how judges out there can try to maintain, we were even dealing with COVID issues, and only so many people could be in the courtroom, and then there's this huge interest. So it's kind of like balancing all of these interests and trying to get the information, letting people see inside courtrooms and to know what that process is like, and then balancing it with someone's right to a fair trial. And I think that it's being used as an example of some ways that we learned how to do it better, maybe, or, by the time Bailey Boswell went to trial, there were certain issues at play there. They had to move the trial because of all the publicity, and also the panel of prospective jurors. I mean, Saline County is only so big, so and everybody had heard after the first trial pretty much every detail. So there were some things that, from a court standpoint, I think we're always, as journalists, going to be dealing with people. The Aubrey Trail was certainly an anomaly. People aren't usually calling you up who are accused of terrible crimes and just telling you every story. You almost have to hang up on him at some point, but so it was definitely a unique experience.
And I'm sure that it takes a toll on you, where you're having to interact with someone who clearly, I mean, you have to, maintain, innocent until proven guilty. But I mean, if someone is all but confessing to you that they committed the crime before they're even charged with it, technically, and you're having to interact with that person and know that that's part of your job, while also interacting with the family and covering all of that. I mean, it's a lot of balls to keep in the air.
It certainly is a unique position to be in. I still will get emails from Aubrey Trail on occasion, and one of his most recent was complaining about the death penalty in Nebraska and how it's broken. And that's something that we're aware of. Currently, we have no way of carrying out the death penalty, although it is on the books in Nebraska. But it's that interesting, like, hearing him complain about it. How much of a voice do you want to give him at this point too? I just, half of the stuff that he tells me or emails me about, it's like I don't do anything with it. But still, it's interesting just even getting an email from someone on death row.
One of the things about this is with Aubrey Trail to varying degrees, but ultimately publicly taking so much of it on himself and absolving Bailey Boswell as much as he was legally able, as well as these other people who might or might not have been in the room, depending on what day it was that he was talking about it. Were there avenues that weren't explored because his taking all of that on was kind of closing that down? I know that they talked in court to two of the women that were possibly in. Coven, would that be the way to describe it? I don't. It was there. I'm assuming they maybe. Well, I don't know the responsibilities that they would have in coming forward with any of that, and possibly being held accountable for anything. But it just seems like there's a lot of loose ends that seems like we'll just never hear back on. But
yeah, Aubrey Trail described it as like he was the vampire and they were his witches. And I mean, it certainly, when the three women testified about what they saw and heard and the conversations that were taking place at that house in Wilbur and elsewhere, it certainly is like as bizarre as you can imagine. And it does make you wonder why they, especially when things started to come out about them being accused of something, accused of a woman's disappearance at first, being involved, why, and we don't know. I know they were looking for one of the women who lives in Omaha. Police were looking for her because she was known to be around them after the disappearance. And to what extent she cooperated, it didn't sound like she did much at first, but then she later was seen almost as one of the victims too, and who could have easily been someone they turned on and killed. So
it seems like this is also, for this to have been the first time that something like this had happened. And with the defense attorneys arguing that all of Aubrey Trail's criminal activity had been fraud and bouncing bad checks, and it seems like this was a little bit out of character, but it was accomplished with such a degree of, well, I mean, on the one hand, it seems very accomplished and, thought out. And then on the other hand, obviously, it is a colossal mess of being incapable at covering up any of this. And it just seems like such a strange thing to be a one-off.
Was it an escalation of something? Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, when you look at the details that he didn't think of, like he paid in cash for all of this, the hacksaws and things that he bought the day of the date when she disappeared. It was like he bought it with cash and then he kept the receipts. It kind of it led law enforcement on this trail, thankfully, to be able to see this in court. Like otherwise, they probably never would have found the security video where he's like, they knew they were able to track his phone and her phone, Bailey's phone, to see kind of how they just followed her around that day, went buying for these things that clearly appear to be the kinds of things you would need to cut up a body and dispose of it. So there was certainly looks like there was planning, but then in other ways, just complete lack of it.
I mean, there's so many bits and pieces of this that are ridiculous, like the ones that you described. The fact that one of the headlines for an article was about the things that were found in the house, and it's like 56 Beanie Babies. I mean, there's just so many little things that are almost perfectly designed. I mean, it almost it's like an Onion article almost. There's this level of almost viral ridiculousness that's at play, and it's something that, for as much as Trail would have been playing the media or using all of that, I mean, that's having 56 Beanie Babies. That's not something you can plan. That's not
certainly unusual.
Yes, indeed. So what is I mean, they've both been sentenced as of now. Is Bailey attempting any appeals? Or well, there's the automatic appeal process, right?
Well, since she didn't get the death penalty, there isn't an automatic appeal for her, but she is appealing. So it's progressing too. There'll probably be oral arguments from the Supreme Court within the next 6 months or so. So, I mean, I guess there are all kinds of arguments about whether or not certain evidence should have gone before the jury that did hear her case, and her defense attorneys are making those arguments now.
And I mean, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but do you foresee this as being a complicated case for well, I mean, obviously anything that's going to make it to the state Supreme Court is going to be a complicated case, but to any bystander, it does look like this should have been a mistrial. But obviously, there's a lot of other things at play where you don't want to set that as a precedent. There's going to have to be a lot of caveats if that's what they go with.
The questions from the justices did seem to indicate that they have serious concerns about making this case a precedent-setting decision where other defendants are sent the message that do something spectacularly crazy in front of the jury, so that if you feel like your case isn't going well, they certainly don't want that happening in Nebraska courtrooms. So then they're left with what the appropriate, the jury could have set this aside. They told the judge that they could, but that said, right, like, I know I'm not going to forget what I saw that day.
Yeah. And then do you know what the timeline of the Supreme Court decision is going to be?
They likely will rule within the next 3 months, I would say, or so. I mean, they aren't on a timeline exactly, so however long they need to do it, several weeks.
Were there any other aspects of the case that I haven't touched on in this conversation, or that might not have been as, front and center in the reporting, that were striking to you that are worth putting back out in the forefronting them more, I guess, and kind of putting a spotlight on them?
At the time, it was really fascinating to us in the courtroom to hear about how the Lincoln police investigator, Bob Hurley, had used the phone information. It was kind of early on in that stage where people could track exactly where phones were based on the information that they got from cell phone providers. But without him tracking down where they left her remains, which was some 60 miles from Wilbur, I mean, it could have been, obviously it took them a while to find her remains to even know that she was dead. So that was kind of fascinating to hear about at trial, because I guess as a layperson, you kind of think that the police would be able to pretty quickly say where our phones were, but that was kind of new technology at the time.
I think the phone information that they got was because one of Sydney's friends logged into Tinder, found Audrey, the sock puppet, whatever account that Bailey and Audrey, the account that they had been using, and from there, started texting.
Right. We don't know to what degree Aubrey Trail may have been texting these people on Tinder. I mean, it could have been kind of his account, and then she would be the one to meet up. It's a little bit unclear, although there were times that Bailey definitely was the one texting because she was alone with her phone. But the friends were pretty critical in helping track down and have police looking for Bailey Boswell, so that they came forward as quickly and with such helpful information. Like, one of them got a cell phone number, even if it wasn't a cell phone number that she used all the time, it still was able to help track them ultimately in Missouri.
Yep. Well, I mean, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for all the work that you do out there, and yeah, just really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
Just want to say thank you to Lori Pilger for taking the time to talk with us and share what it was like to be covering everything. And you can find contact info for her and links to the articles we talked about in the show notes. Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles is a product of Lee Enterprises. It is produced, recorded, edited, and hosted by myself, Chris Lay. Articles are read by Matt McGrath. As always, if you appreciate what we're doing with this program, or any other true crime podcast for that matter, we encourage you to invest in local journalism and support whichever newspaper it is that serves your community.
Make a difference. Relish a great work-life balance. Enjoy generous benefits and competitive pay. Go home each night feeling fulfilled by your work. Work for an employer of choice. Work for Blue Ridge Hospice. We're always looking to hire compassionate RNs, CNAs, or anyone interested in office or thrift shop work. We've been your not-for-profit community hospice since 1981. Visit our website for more information or to apply today at blueridgehospice.org. That's blueridgehospice.org. Blue Ridge Hospice is an equal opportunity employer.